Started. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to join us for the so-called Master Forum series. Today we'll have a speaker from Australia, and this is a special friend, actually in the family of IRDR. So I met John, by this opportunity to work collaboration internationally with colleagues around the world. And I found that John had a different background with me, and I'm kind of a natural geoscience scientist, but John has provide maybe different view from the social science to look at the the integrated research around the disaster risk reduction. So as the world now changing continuously, now we have a really different kind of disaster could affect us. Not only earthquake, flood, but we still at the hopefully at the end of the pandemic, COVID, right? So we really like to have a new. We have the intention to invite the speaker from the world to talk about the probably the new thinking, new thoughts. So today's speaker, John Handmer, which he is a well established scientist in Australia, and his specialty is on the disaster prevention from the perspective of, like I said, social perspective. So he had got a lot of award. I didn't want to mention often, but I'm really happy to have him to give a talk in this forum. So as a host of ICOE Taipei, on behalf of that, I thank everybody joined this. Hope you enjoy the talk, and especially thanks John. And I will ask Yudao Chen, who is the Sustainability Research Center at Academia Sinica, give us some words. Please, Yudao.
Thank you, Jianchen. I guess we have a lot of participants online. Okay, I'm not sure that the bandwidth is good enough. So some message told us a little bit breaking. So I just try to speak slowly. Good morning, especially in Taipei, and good afternoon, our friends and our distinguished presenter, Dr. John Handmer, also our special guest, Dr. Gordon McBain, Dr. Li Jianchen, my colleagues, ICOE Taipei, IRDR. Welcome to this Master Forum. Today, while I speak on behalf of Academia Sinica, welcome you to participate as Master Forum series, I guess the first talk of 2022. We will introduce you, John Handmer, a little bit introduced by Jensen already. Actually, our ICOE Taipei IRDR learned a lot from this science committee IRDR, which Dr. John Handmer was the member and the chair for a term. And we really appreciate the interaction during that period. Okay, about today's topic, we already as we already perceived, the global risk landscape faces new challenges for disaster risk reduction and its associated areas of climate change adaptation. Because of the future trend of getting worse, I guess people can feel that. All those possible impacts of systematic, compound, and cascading risk have drawn global concern recently. Well, I guess the human input, we all believe, play a major role of such a global change, which remind us the stress of all tipping points for all affected Earth systems, like hydro system, biosystem, all those related to collapse or worsening, need our endeavor to take or try to recover. Today's focus, the landscape of global disaster risk, is characterized by severe degradation and the environment ecosystem service from hydro to bio to anthroposphere. I guess the recent COVID pandemic is one of this manifestation. Well, it's really our honor to listen to this talk. There's a simple introduction to Dr. John Handmer. He is from Australia and also has a second base in Vienna, work for IASA, and also take the job as the major member in the science committee of IRDR. That's why we all very happy to work with Dr. John Handmer, and I don't need to introduce too much his long experience, work experience on disaster risk reduction from another point of view, social science. Well, those are very important elements for this subject. This master forum, I believe, will one by one, after many talks, inspire many participants to have deeper and better understanding of the global framework in DRR related issues. Well, again, I welcome you to join us today or even in the future. The master foreign talks prepared by the IRD ICOE Taipei. So welcome all the participants online. And I, on behalf of Academia Sinica, appreciate the effort the staff of IRD ICOE Taipei. You did a good job, and wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much as host of Academia Sinica. Okay, so let's go to the main part of this talk. That's John. John, please, that's your turn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, Dr. Chen, for your kind words and welcome. Let me see if I can, how's this going to... Good.
Excellent.
Good.
Okay.
Good. Well, I'd just like to, please, a couple of things. If you can't hear me, Jan Chen, please let me know. And could you also keep track of the time? Because with the full screen, actually, I've just realized I can't see the time. I might just, excuse me, I'll get a clock. Okay.
Yeah, but John, don't worry too much about the time. We have some flexibility.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, thanks to IRDR, the ICOE in Taipei for organizing this seminar and for kindly hosting me at this presentation. I would like to acknowledge with appreciation the many other people who are part of the production of this document that we're going to discuss today. In particular, my co-chair, Colleen Vogel, the Chief Science Officer, Ben Payne, Anne-Sophie Stevance from the ISC, and Jenti Kirschwood from UNDRR, Kunli Han and Fang Liang from the IRDR IPO, Michael Boylan from the SEI, and many others who commented and had input and supported the production of this document in multiple ways. Okay. Today, let's get rid of this. Today, we want to examine this framework from three perspectives. What was the production of it? What was the rationale? And how were these priorities that we'll talk about, and which in many ways are the centerpiece of the framework, how were they arrived at? And then what are these priorities? What do they actually consist of? What's the logic around them? And finally, and fairly briefly, I'd like to touch on some issues of substantive and philosophical nature that arose during the development of the framework. At every step in its development, decisions had to be made about what was going to be in or out, or how we were going to deal with various imperatives. And these issues, I think, are an important part of reflecting on the priorities, on the framework, and on the way forward. The basic rationale has been set out for us rather clearly by Dr. Chen in his introductory remarks. Really, it's about the changing landscape of disaster risk. And he put out some points like these ones, that the disaster trend appears to be for far more severe and complex impacts. I mean, this can all be pretty depressing reading. I've noted recently there's more commentary and talk of among politicians, but also among some researchers, of unimaginable impacts and conditions. This is in my particular field of wildfires in particular, and heat waves, of course. There's increasing concern about, as Dr. Chen mentioned, about the more complex risks, systemic, compound, cascading risks and impacts. Often in the Australian fires of a couple of years ago, to take an example I'm familiar with, really without any apparent boundaries. Usually we can put reasonable boundaries in time and space around what we're looking at, around the events, but increasingly it's very difficult. Of course, COVID is another example. There's no real, I think that we'd have to agree that there's no, that the only spatial boundary is the globe, and the time boundary is better. Sometimes it's better not to think about it. There's also the whole issue of existential risk. Now, this has been around in discussion for very many years, but there's a reality about the contemporary discussion on existential risks that wasn't there before. These are risks that threaten humanity's existence, at least in parts of the globe. There is the underlying this is severe degradation of ecosystem services, which is shown in climate change and biodiversity loss. The biodiversity loss is actually very frightening if one reads about the details of it. But this is only part of the picture. As has been said already, the social economic side of things, it's very important not to lose sight of it. The fact that we have in the globe contributing to a lot of our management and strategic thinking challenges are social and financial crises, extreme inequalities and vulnerabilities, the hyperconnectivity which is seen in the world just seen to make things worse, and of course from the point of view of disaster risk reduction, and of course the COVID pandemic, which we're in. Well, we may not be in the middle of it, but we're still well within it. The era we're in is often referred to, as I think most of us will be familiar with, as the Anthropocene era. that is because humanity is seen now as the primary force driving planetary change. This is very dramatic. It's clear recognition of Earth's system tipping points, planetary boundaries. Recently, in the last few weeks, a major study into the oceans has argues that the ocean systems as a whole have passed a tipping point in terms of temperature. This has a lot of implications because of the stability of the temperatures in the oceans. But the limitation of thinking about our present context as the Anthropocene era is that this is really focused on the biophysical world, whereas we need to spend a lot of effort on the human societies and economies, as well as biophysical. The Anthropocene itself doesn't address that. It's clear that regardless of whether you think this is really seriously pessimistic or whether you actually think that I'm being optimistic in outlining this, there are new challenges for disaster risk reduction and for its underlying risk drivers. And if we look at them as on a large scale, we have not come to grips with them yet. So to meet these challenges, I think that there's a view that we need to rethink how we approach our task of disaster risk reduction. This diagram sets out one view of the history of the field from a global point of view. I leave it in here. I think it's one view, and of course it doesn't take account of the current view post Sendai Framework 2015, which includes the other major agreements also signed in 2015, which we're going to look at in a moment, and which are very much part of current thinking in disaster risk reduction. So I would argue that we've moved on considerably from just thinking about the Sendai Agreement as the endpoint here. Just to do it the way. Sorry, I just got to. So the as I said, our starting point in terms of institutional structures is the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. This sets out a number of targets, and in terms of our thinking about what we wanted to achieve with the framework and research agenda, we wanted to ensure that we help support achieving these targets, the 7 targets, and their underlying risk drivers. We took the view that we can't do this fully without looking at areas and global imperatives outside disaster risk reduction. So this takes us to, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change signed at the same time. And I think it's well established that much of the change in risks in natural hazards is driven by climate change. It's not all of it, of course, because there are geohazards where there may not be a connection. But for all climate hazards, there are direct implications from climate change. In some cases, such as wildfires, heat, perhaps typhoons, the climate is a key driver. We take the view then that if we, in terms of looking at the hazards, that is the biophysical side of disaster risk, natural hazards and disaster risk, we absolutely need to take account of climate change and what we can do about it, both in terms of immediate adaptation, which strongly overlaps with a lot of conventional disaster risk reduction, but also in longer term mitigation through decarbonisation. This puts a lot of perhaps pressure is the wrong word, but pressure on disaster risk reduction to ensure that what is done in the name of disaster risk reduction aligns with the imperative of decarbonisation. So in other words, in my field of fire, one of the favourite most widely practiced methods of fire risk reduction is prescribed burning fuel. This contributes to global carbon. So there are some initiatives underway which are attempting to reduce that, but this is a very important issue, which I feel the field has not really grasped. So considering climate change and Paris and so on, this is very important for getting a grip on the trends in the hazard side of the biophysical side of the risk equation, but it doesn't do by itself a great deal for the human dimensions. And for that, the Sustainable Development Goals need to be considered. This is also an agreement that was signed in the same year, 2015, as the other agreements. The Sustainable Development Goals directly address a number of issues that are fundamental to vulnerability to natural hazards, to disasters. And they include here, we can see, just to pick a few out, poverty, hunger, health, education, equalities of various sorts, livelihoods, and peace and strong institutions, risk governance, among other things that we can see in the 17 goals. If we don't include thinking about what's in the Sustainable Development Goals, our understanding of risk will be partial, because the risk, by definition, especially in our field at least, includes very much all these aspects that contribute to vulnerabilities and marginalisation, as well as the biophysical hazards. To highlight this, a number of the public demonstrations and marches that occurred around about the times of the various COP agreements in Glasgow and Paris and so on. I think this one is actually from Paris, but it may not be. These integrate or attempt to integrate concerns about climate, concerns about justice for people, and concerns about livelihoods, which in a way gets at the sorts of things that we need to consider to have a really good grasp of the risks that we're facing. So let's look at the actual production of the framework document. So we've looked at the rationale. Let's look at the production. The drivers, the overall drivers were, as we've been discussing, but there was also an internal institutional reality that the IRDR science plan, which lasted 10 years, was up for review. And so it needed to be renewed in some form or another. And there was a lot of discussion around this, and of the sort that I've just taken us through, looking at the broad agreements and their priorities and so on. And so a decision was taken after a lot of intense discussion to go beyond the traditional DRR that had been the focus of the IRDR thinking and plan, to take account of the changed risk landscape and changed risk institutional landscape, to develop a research agenda with a much more global reach. This started with an outline drafted by Kunli Han of the IRDR IPO, and then there was various guidance documents. This took a while, I think, because every step was the subject of negotiation discussion between a lot of the key sponsors and stakeholders. We surveyed the IRDR community, which is quite large. For those that aren't aware, there's the IRDR Scientific Committee and former members of the committee. There are the IRDR International Centres of Excellence, of which the Taipei group is one, and they are scattered around the globe. There's also a number of national committees also around the globe. So these were surveyed and asked for input, as were others that we chose who we thought would give different perspectives. And we also did a review of the literature, relevant literature, or what we thought was the relevant literature. Probably, in retrospect, if we could, we'd do a much broader review if we redid it. But okay, that's what we did at the time. And then to broaden, there was a concern that we didn't just want, not that there's anything wrong with our colleagues in the traditional disaster risk reduction field, but we wanted to broaden that to include people from climate, to include people from the Sustainable Development Goals, to include the private sector and so on. So there was a lot of, and funders perhaps, and people who wanted to include people with a wide range of views and expertise. And so the expert review group was established with some 40 or 50 members to provide this input. There were also specific groups representing Indigenous interests and the private sector to also help ensure that we had as broad an input as practicable at the time. Drafts. So this process actually, at that time, that was pretty exciting for us because we were getting there were a lot of very different views and a lot of quite innovative thinking and so on. Then, but of course, putting all this into a draft can make things seem a little less interesting perhaps, or a little more mundane, but there was a series of drafts and then we produced one that was more or less complete, which went to the expert review group and to a survey on the International Science Committee's website. This was a bit terrifying because this was, anyone could actually look at the draft and comment on it at that stage. It wasn't restricted to an expert group or anything like that. In the end, we got about 100 individuals who produced comments, many of them very, very detailed comments. This is great. Of course, there's a lot of work in synthesizing and going through them all, but there are a lot of different views. So some were contradictory, but mostly supportive, but suggesting how things could or should be improved, and occasionally outraged comments on something we'd said. So these were all taken on board in the IPCC sort of manner, in that we looked at each comment, what part of the document it referred to, and what we could do about it. This led to what we call a first order draft. We called these early drafts zero order drafts so that people would treat them as very very much a drafts, initial drafts. Then we produced a first order draft for the 2021 IRDR conference, which was held in the middle of last year and was built around the draft of the framework. And it's fair to say, I think, during this, just before the event and during the event, the ideas in the document were subject to fairly intense scrutiny and discussion. And we also selected a wide range of people to make direct comments on it. Mostly these were very positive, plenty of suggestions. As I said here, the numbers were impressive. We had over 400 people registrations, and one of the great advantages of having to hold it virtually is that these 400 plus people came from all over the world. And that would not have been the case if it had been a face-to-face meeting, quite certainly. There were some 800,000 views per day on social media to the conference and the deliberations and documents of the conference. This doesn't mean 800,000 people were looking at the material, but it does mean that there were a lot of people engaged in looking at it. So based on all the feedback we got from this, which most people were pretty happy with it, most of the comments were by way of observations rather than critical comments at this stage. And a final draft was produced late last year. There were a number of themes in this in the framework, and of course, I'm just in addition to the major agreements, the Sendai Paris Climate Change Agreement and the SDGs that are referred to throughout most of the framework. One of the themes is about social justice. Now, social justice is a term that we can and do define to suit whatever we want to argue for, I guess. And it's expressed in lots of different types of justice: climate justice, disaster justice, environmental justice, so But it's also expressed in the major agreements like the Sendai, and it's very much part of the Sustainable Development Goals. The whole some people would argue that the Sustainable Development Goals are based on the idea of social justice and equity. The Sendai statement itself has a major theme of leave no one behind, which is also another way of thinking about social justice in the context of, say, vulnerabilities and disaster risk reduction. So that's a theme, a major theme throughout. A transdisciplinary approach is also a major theme. Now, we've used the term transdisciplinary here. I've also used interdisciplinary because these terms are not defined in a way that's not contested. But here, I mean, scientists and researchers working together without the impediment of traditional disciplinary boundaries, but also working with practitioners and policymakers and other stakeholders outside the private sector, for example, outside academic and research groups. There's an implicit interrogation throughout the document of where we are or been with DRI and where we need to go. I mean, that's a major thing. So the framework document that we finally produced has, of course, a lot devoted to rationale and background material, which we've been going through. It has the research priorities, and it has a substantial section which discusses implementation issues. It is not a how to implement section. It's really more about issues and so on. And we may discuss that more later. So now I want to look at the research priorities. The research priorities, there's too much text on this slide. I don't know how that happened. Apologies. But just a couple of points from it before going on. The priorities are not intended to start, they're not intended to be prescriptive. They are about starting a conversation about what might be possible to do in terms of research or compiling evidence for particular purposes. This is what we hope. And the document is pitched at a global level. So that means, I think almost inevitably, there needs to be a link created between what the document is saying and what's relevant in any particular context. The priorities came from these extensive and intensive consultations that I've just sketched through, but they also need to take account of the major concerns of the sponsors, in particular the Science Council and UNDRR. They have their own networks and global networks, and they also had their own priorities and needs and views on gaps. What perhaps is interesting is that in the end, this really perhaps made one difference. That's all. I think there was a very strong overlap, and the only difference would be hazards, and I'll mention that in a moment. I think I'll now go. Of course, the priorities needed to address fundamental issues. They're not about details. Of course, a lot of people, quite rightly, sent in their ideas on what should be included, but they often were very much about details. For example, we need to have, and using an example, don't want to be negative, we need to have a much better grip on modelling X. I think this is absolutely right, I'm sure, but that's not what a global level priorities are about. And I think let me just have a look. I think I'm going to go to the next slide, which is directly on the priorities. I'm just going to shift this little look. So, as I said, these 9 priorities sketched out here, I'll just step through them and try to show some logic in them. The first priority towards the top right is a broad priority about understanding the evolving global risk scene. And there are a lot of ways of looking at this, of course, but that was a very widely held view that we really needed a much better understanding on the complexity of the risks that we were increasingly seeming to face. A key part of what constitutes risk, as we've said before today, is the inequalities, vulnerabilities, marginalisation, and so on within countries, cities, and across the world. And so that is our second priority. If there's a single area where I would say people were very passionate about inclusion of a topic, it would be this one. And this might reflect the sort of people who tended to have more input, but definitely this was considered an absolutely top priority. So that's a key part of any risk or any disaster, but also we appreciate that we need to know about the hazard, the biophysical or technological or human-induced hazard. That's priority 4, and there's a lot of new thinking about what constitutes a hazard and what it means. The report shown on the lower right, Hazard Definition Classification Review, was finished, I think, last year by the ISC and the UNDRR. And this looked at hazards quite differently coming out of Sendai, because Sendai also attempted to portray hazards differently. It includes human-made hazards such as violence, technological failures, and so on. And the idea of this, which is very different and I think highlights a different approach to hazards, is that this report attempts to conceptualize hazards and thinking about hazards as a way of supporting the implementation of Sendai and also Paris and the SDGs. So to provide a way of thinking about hazards and generate the data to support these major agreements across all of the major agreements, not just a disaster one. Many people have argued that, as we've seen in priority 5, that technologies, modern technology, data, artificial intelligence, so on, create wonderful opportunities, but also create a lot of problems and hazards. And the hyperconnectivity that goes with them creates its own hazards and problems. In this document, our view is that we have to be optimistic, and these technologies and the data sets that are now developing and available provide absolutely unparalleled analytical tools and power to increase our understanding of whatever we are concerned about, and that needs to be applied positively. So that is also, these are all part of thinking about the risk. Of course, perhaps one of the great weaknesses in risk management and thinking is governance. We've called it governance. We could also call it other things, but institutions and so on. And that's priority 3. We really do need better risk governance at most levels. I think that would be a fair comment, because we can have all this understanding and we're getting better at it, but to make best use of that requires good institutional arrangements. This all is to lead to a changes and transition. As we've said, DRR needs to be rethought radically in some cases, but as set out in priority 7, we don't want to leave people behind. We don't want people to find that they have to make changes. For example, one that's right in front of myself and some colleagues at the moment is the issue of relocation of some communities in our region. This really needs to be thought through so that it's done in the most equitable way possible. So this is very critical. Just application of just transitions concept well beyond simply decarbonisation, but to address and support all kinds of changes that are happening. To know what's happening, we need measurement, priority 8, and we need to make sure that drives progress and doesn't just perform an auditing function. We are aware that in doing a global set of priorities, there'll be a lot of regional differences, and they need to be taken into account. And priority 9 is really about ourselves as researchers. We need to collaborate more, we talk about this a lot, and there's perhaps a lot less evidence for it than there ought to be. And one of the really different things about this priority, I think, is that it's about how, at one level, it's about how science and scientists work. And so the solution, or a lot of the solution, is in our own hands. We don't have to wait for the UN or governments or others to make changes and legislative changes on it. We can do it ourselves. Well, that's the idea. How are we going for time? We're okay?
Time is good. It's 30 minutes.
Okay, maybe I'll give just a couple of very brief examples on a couple of the priorities, because I know some people have asked about these and I've given it some thought, and it's not easy actually, because I guess these are aspirational priorities. But so priority 2, which is about inclusion and not leaving anyone behind. And I thought I'm going to use a couple of Australian examples, not because I think Australia is necessarily full of good examples, but because they're to hand. You know, I know about them. And this one is on, it's not meant to be a controversial topic, but it is. It's become one in the last few weeks. I sit in a city, Canberra, where there is, depending on which government website you look at, 100% vaccination or 98.5% vaccination. And yet there's been a lot of pushback about vaccination from outside the city. When the government, our government drew up its vaccination program, which has been widely criticised, so I'll put that, they had a list of priorities, and instead of, one approach would be, and we often do this in disaster stuff, is everyone has access to whatever, public information or evacuation centre or whatever. But in this case, the groups that were seen as the most vulnerable groups were ranked first for vaccinations across the country. Now, apart from all the issues and difficulties with achieving that, the idea, and there's some other issues that occurred, but the idea is definitely one based on equity, in that simply making vaccines available to everybody means that a lot of people won't get them. But they targeted increasingly by making the vaccines available first for those who were the most at risk from COVID, and then actually spending, I think, a lot of effort, some would say not nearly enough, but nevertheless a lot of effort to persuade people who were hesitant about getting the vaccine for whatever reason, trying to persuade them politely and tactfully, and then through big sticks to get vaccinated, is a way, especially in far rural areas and with Indigenous populations, trying to ensure that everybody got the benefit of this. So that's one example. And you can see that probably in a lot of countries with the COVID vaccinations. Another one, the other one I want to talk about is the collaboration, the last priority, collaboration across sciences and so on, priority 9. And I've thought about this and thought it's actually very difficult to think of good collaborative. I can think of plenty of partial collaborative exercises. But someone suggested that we have, after we have major events in Australia, the politicians like to set up inquiries because that puts it at arm's length. So after the devastating fires in 2009 in Victoria, there was a very well-funded major inquiry run by very top-level lawyers. And they tended to be very dedicated to their task. Anyway, they had the funds to do it. So where there was a gap so they tried to, there are a number of issues they were looking at, and they accepted evidence from the academics, from published research material, from practitioners, their experience at fighting fires and all the rest of it, from people who lived in the bush for decades, and from international experts and specialists, in fact, from anyone. But they then filtered through it for credibility. And they weren't held back by concerns about the disciplinary basis or validity of any particular source of evidence. And I think it's quite remarkable. I found it very hard to think of other cases where really they would accept and give and listen to evidence or material or expertise or experience from whoever was wanting to put it forward. Of course, they had to sort out some of the the more challenging stuff, but they did so. So that's one example. If we're looking for examples in practice of something, and the other advantage of this commission is that because of its high status in government and the media, when the commission goes through all the evidence from multiple sources and makes a finding or recommendation, that has an extremely good chance of getting into policy or practice because of the arrangements. I couldn't really think of another institution where it was so devoted to looking at all the evidence, producing a finding, and then having that finding into policy, almost, not automatically, but almost. Of course, the politicians and bureaucracy can undermine it, but nevertheless. So that's I could go on, but I won't because there's time. So we are now at the third part, brief part of this talk, which is looking at some of the debates and issues that came up. I'm just going to look at a few. There were many, of course, because everything had to be negotiated and resolved in a pragmatic way, because we only had a few people working part-time, more or less, on the volunteers and so on the project, and we had various time limits and so on. I've talked at length in the rationale about moving away from traditionally defined disaster risk reduction towards something that was much more inclusive and broad-ranging. We did that. But I just wanted to point out it's not straightforward. I mean, it might seem obvious. Of course, we have to embrace these wider things. But people pointed out we need warnings and we need emergency management more than ever. When we look at and humanitarian support after an event. When we started this talk by talking about the greater impact and more frequent impact of disasters, and unfortunately, whether we like it, and some people try to say these aren't so important. We need better warnings, we need better support during the event, and we need better recovery support. So these traditional things are, in some ways, as important or more important than ever. So that was one debate. Some people felt that the framework contained nothing new, that the terminology was the only thing that was different. This is interesting, and people are very passionate about it. We believe, for a start, the institutional environment is completely different from 2015. So that's a big change with these global agreements and the governments all signing up to them and so on. The risk landscape, we also believe, if it has changed, and if it hasn't changed, it's viewed and thought about completely differently, which gives us much more opportunities to address it. Some people took a strong view that they're quite concerned about remaining locked into traditional framings of risk, because this might lead us to fail to appreciate what we now understand is about all the interacting risks. The interacting risks being something like, let's say, a major flood, interacting with the chronic risks of poverty. So there's a lot of ways of viewing this, and I think the argument here is that we now look at these things differently. We now look at them in a much more holistic way, and that's a big change. But there is the other view. One of the things that we discussed throughout the production of the document, and you know, it's as I said, with these issues, they're not resolved in the sense that they go away. They're always there because they're always they indicate limitations with what we do, what we've done. We talk a lot about the importance of having multiple voices and roles throughout the document. So the question arises, well, how did we go ourselves in producing this document? We had targeted consultations early on, but we also tried to have an open survey or two. But how representative were the consultations? I mean, of regions, disciplines, sectors, organisations, youth, and so on, private sector, and so on. It goes on. One view, my view, is that this can only, my view, maybe others would disagree, is that we can only ever be partial. So it's a question of how much effort we put into it, because we can't consult the world. Although some UN groups have tried to, and maybe they're successful. One group that we did debate and talk about trying to touch into was a global civil society. I'm not sure what global civil society would be, but there are organisations that purport to represent it, and they weren't really included. Perhaps they should have been. So this is just part of this ongoing argument. Another aspect of this is what about the role of us as writers, myself and my colleagues who put this document together? This hasn't been commented on by anybody outside, but certainly to what extent is it our views? Is it legitimate to have our views in the document? And to what extent do we be careful to make sure that we're reflecting the views of all the people we consulted? And I think it's very important that we go out of our way to make sure that the consultation processes and commentaries are directly reflected in the document, but there probably inevitably are compromises. So a major debate every now, especially towards the latter part of doing the document, putting the document together, was, well, what about, not because of COVID so much, but just generally, what about the role and characterization of science? At the start, the audience was seen to be scientists for the document. I think that evolved quite a bit. I've just used here an example of the problems with saying we're going to be very inclusive in our approach to science, because a lot of people don't agree with it. So to go to the second point here, science versus the war on science, we all agreed on having lots of other sources of knowledge and viewpoints. Some people would say they want them all in, but does that mean including people who think science is the enemy? I mean, this is we didn't discuss this, but it was implicit in some of the discussion. And what does it mean to be fully inclusive? In the end, the view in the second point prevailed, which is that in an era of attacks on science, manifesting in rejection of the science around climate change and COVID-19 infection control by some people, but these people have powerful friends too. Was it sensible to support criticism of science in this context? Normally we'd reflect on science and talk about the limitations and so on, but I thought this might not be the best moment. Anyway, so that's another open question. Although some people thought, well, contemporary science, this was a very small but vocal view, is a part of Western domination or Western attempts to dominate. As someone who's been in science a long while, I do think it's rather strange to think that the West dominates science, or has done for a long while, but it is a view. I see, and I think science is generally seen as very much a global project with intense collaboration exchange. Inhibited a bit by governments, but not by scientists, I would argue, at least. With China absolutely dominating scientific publications, India in third place after USA. So, but this is, as I said, these are ongoing discussions and debate, and this last point is an area in academic discussion of intensely passionate debate. So yeah, who would have thought in something as innocuous as a priority list for disaster risk reduction? Thank you very much for listening and for your time. Two final points. I think I've got a comment there about what we might be able to do ourselves as scientists, and implementation of the document is under discussion, led by the International Science Council. I checked with them just before this meeting, and will be a major part of the future of IRDR and other related global groups, probably like Future Earth. Maybe I will add that this is great for global science, but doesn't address the interests directly of, say, local governments or NGOs. My belief is that we need a small, highly accessible translation guide which would link what we have here more closely. It's not going to be perfect, but link it more closely with the needs and interests of local people. But at the moment, that's just an idea. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It was a very nice talk. I think with a lot of thoughtful view, open-minded. And thank you. So let's have enter into a Q&A session. So I encourage the audience to write down your question with your name first, your name, where you come from, affiliation, question on the YouTube chat box, right? So we can put it on to John that him to answer your question. So now I have 3. Let me just go through one by one. Okay, John. So I read a question and for you. Okay. So the first question comes from Ken Adrian Akakan from Philippine Red Cross. And the question is, how did the COVID-19 pandemic change the risk science frameworks, particularly on discourse on uncertainties?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. You've only got 3 questions in front of you. I'll just quickly respond then. Yep.
Yeah, please.
Look, we started this it might seem hard to believe, but we started it in 2019. And so we were underway when the COVID pandemic started. But of course, I suppose like most people, we thought the pandemic it'd be out of the way or at least under control within months. So things progressed, perhaps. So the short answer is it had inevitably had some influence, but we took the view, we had some discussions on this, that all the other types of disasters were continuing to occur, and the inequalities and problems that we were focused on were continuing as before, if not worse. And so that while COVID pandemic was a context for what we did, we decided not to let it drive our thinking. Now, in retrospect, if we knew it was going to go on for years and so on, we might have done it differently. But that was our thing at the time. The discourses on uncertainties, we certainly had them, and I've had them in other contexts. And there's a surprising range of views on COVID and uncertainty. I think I would agree with what you're saying, which is that it was it dramatically demonstrated how we need to be ready for all kinds of uncertainties. But I was surprised at some of my colleagues who thought this was entirely predictable. So I'm sorry, it's an unsatisfactory answer.
All right, so let's go to the second question I have in my mind, in my hand. That's from Clarissa Rogers from University of Cambridge. Question is, what is going to happen after the new scientific agenda for the Sendai framework was launched? How are they going to implement it?
Well, this is of course the question that a lot of us have, and it's in the hands of the sponsors at this stage. That's not me trying to avoid the question totally, but so that's the International Science Council. They have advised me today. I don't know whether anyone from the council is actually listening. Probably it's the wrong time of day, but they've advised that they are in discussions with a couple of groups. I'm not sure that I should say who they are, but that does involve the future of IRDR and the agenda being core for it, and also the other groups. As I said at the end of the talk, the difficulty is that I think some of us have with that is that that's great for the global science scene, and it does mean that this agenda does contribute to thinking at the global science level, which is appropriate, because otherwise, because that was its initial main audience. But what about all the other possible groups who could get benefit or would like to get something from it? That's what's currently lacking. And I think it'd be fair to say that if there are any ideas on this, please pass them on to myself or the ISC, because right now they are very much open-minded. They've got some ideas on what they're going to do, but they're very much open-minded on what else they can do for implementation.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question, Kendra Gonzalez from Manila University. So the question is, would you be able to share case studies that illustrate how the framework can be applied to mobilize action on the ground at the local government level?
This is a very challenging question. It's a good question, but it's also very challenging. I suppose there's a couple of ways of answering this. One way would be to say, look, the idea of this global framework is that it's a global framework for risk science to support actions, and it's a long way from local government. That would be one approach, and that we do need, as I said, some translation document, which I support the production of, but I don't know what the ISC thinks. Now another, maybe I can try an example. It's not exactly at low government level, but I was talking with a colleague who's working, I want to be a little bit careful here because no one wants their names or anything spread around, but who's working on a relocation strategy for a South Pacific island nation. Relocation as a result of climate-induced hazards or disasters. And the view was that this document, even though it's so far removed from a tiny village in the Pacific nation, it could still be quite useful for them. They would use it through their spokespeople, NGOs and government people, and church people, very important in these places, to argue for a just transition approach, and to argue for a focus on inequalities, reducing the inequalities that currently exist, and ensuring that after the location, inequalities don't deteriorate, which is an experience that often happens. So it's slightly roundabout, but my colleagues thought that, which surprised me a bit, I have to say, but it's good, that this sort of document, they had used other similar documents in this way, would be directly useful at this local level. So there are ways of doing it. It's a very specific type of example, and I think, I would like to think of other case studies and draw up other case studies that, even if they're very theoretical, that might help to show how this sort of document or framework could assist and support local governments. I'm very happy to engage in later discussion about this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next question comes from Mushin Lee from Academic Syndicate here. The question is, okay, so first thanks for the inspiring talk. And the question is that how to inform civil society of the risk landscape to increase the risk perception and do collective action.
These questions are really fascinating. Dr. Lee, maybe you should publish them with a whole set of detailed responses, because they're all none of them are simple. Well, this question, I don't know whether you know this, but the International Science Council and UNDRR were some elements of those organizations were very concerned about risk perception. But we found that and wanted risk perception in there, in the document. It's not in the document explicitly, because our people we consulted didn't see it as a priority, maybe a local priority, but not national. So how to inform this? I don't know how to do better than we're currently doing, I'd have to say. I suppose two reasons for that, but we need to do better. One is that anyone who has any connection in Australia anyway, and I'm sure it's the case in many other countries, has any connection to global media or even local media, knows that there's constantly severe crises triggered by climate-related and non-climate-related hazards, and that in the mainstream media, these are often attributed, whether rightly or not, is not the issue, attributed to climate change or to other things that humans are doing. And so, to me, that people are constantly getting this information to them, and of course they're also getting in many places, including Australia, a lot of very specific information on hazards and potential problems in their neighbourhoods. So they're already doing this, and yet we know that most people don't see themselves, in many countries anyway, at risk, or they see that there is a problem, but they're not going to be affected directly by it, and so on. So I think that, and we've looked with others extensively at the marketing and advertising literature, for example, the health promotion literature, which has probably been the most successful. And there is some advice that we can get from that literature, but generally speaking, I think I could sum up the state, and people are going to disagree with this, so apologies, sum up the state of play with persuading people about these sort of things by saying, quoting an advertising researcher recently who said that there's more advertising than ever, way more, and yet we know it's less effective than ever. So, but we don't know why. There's lots of theories and ideas. This is, maybe we should have had it, you're starting to persuade me that we should have somehow had it in there. This is an area of intense concern, I think, for emergency managers and planners and their affiliates all over the world. If you knew the answer to that question, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, definitely tough question to complicated question too. So let's go to, we have several questions. Let's see what's the next.
I'll try and be quicker.
So the next question, let's see. Okay, so this comes from Nander Norisa from NTOU Taiwan. So the question here, you can see there are lots of human-induced disasters like COVID-19, terrorism, biological, chemical threat, etc. How does the framework handle this unexpected catastrophe condition?
Thanks for this. Look, again, a couple of ways. There's one of the priorities, I haven't got them in front of me, and I'll probably get it wrong, on hazards. New thinking in hazards, I think, addresses part of this question directly, in that now under that conceptualization of hazards, there's nothing unusual about, from a hazard point of view, about terrorism, biological threats, COVID, and so on. They're considered as part of what we have to deal with. So that's part of it, but of course it's much more complicated and sophisticated in the actual thinking than what I've just said. The other part of it is thinking about more complex risks is absolutely part of the framework, and thinking about the distribution of the impacts of those risks is very much part of that framework. And let's suppose that we know that we're going to have a range of catastrophic events of the sort you've mentioned, some and others, but we don't know when or what they'll be. We would, of course, some people would study the risks and threats and try and get a better handle on it, but others of us would work on improving human resilience by reducing inequalities and trying to push forward aspects of the SDGs. And so I think the framework, it doesn't handle the things you talk about specifically or precisely, but I would argue it's largely about preparing ourselves for them, to handle them better, whatever they might be.
All right, so let's go to the next. Probably that's, I don't know, probably the question from Ayusha. Yeah. Ayusha Sharma from she's a I don't know, he or she PhD student from environmental engineering, CYNU in Taiwan. Okay. The questions here. So he said, thank you for the talks. Yeah. So question is how to increase stakeholder engagement. Big question. And any improvement methodology of social science you would recommend?
Look, there's a number of answers to this question. We were very successful with our stakeholder engagement, so by conventional methods. In other words, approaching people that think that they have something to say in this field because they want to say it. It's part of their identity. But of course, when we're trying to get other people to engage, that was very difficult, and we did have some success, but very limited. I would say I don't know what the best methods are when we are all doing everything online. I think that was definitely a limiting factor. What I would have done if it hadn't been online, we might have gone to say, this is just an example. We didn't have civil society directly engaged in the framework development. There would be conferences or meetings of civil society representatives around the world, and we might have gone to some of those meetings. And then you've got a captured audience, and you can talk through people, and a lot of them, hopefully many of them, will be interested enough to talk to you. So I don't think there's any one approach. It does depend on the particular group you're interested in, but I would say usually a face-to-face approach works a lot better than an email, but we've been restricted up to now. But hopefully soon we'll be able to use the face-to-face methods of persuasion and engagement, and that's definitely much more effective at getting groups that normally wouldn't think about the subject area.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so next, let me see. Probably this one from Zhen Yilin from Tam Kiang University, Department of Architecture. So the question is, should risk landscape include human aging demography response to risk as part of inclusiveness in the design to better mitigation?
Right. Well, look, I often think I want to thank you for this question because this is something that's very close to my heart. But I suppose if we look globally, so this is a roundabout way of avoiding the question. If we look globally, the countries that perhaps have very significant vulnerabilities and limited capacities have very young populations. Very young populations, extraordinarily young. Countries like Japan have a pretty old population. I was sort of stunned, actually, just how aging it is, but they also have the capacities to deal with it to the extent that that might be a problem. We didn't specifically have aging, as far as I know, it's not in the section on vulnerabilities and inclusiveness, but that is only because we only had a paragraph or so to talk about it, and that's the only reason it wouldn't be in there. Otherwise, it would definitely be included in a general statement. I mean, it's inadequate, but in a general statement about groups that are more vulnerable. One of the other issues with this is that older people tend to generally that we've come across do not want to be referred to as vulnerable or elderly or anything. So that's another issue. But doesn't mean that we shouldn't take them into account. I should say there are groups which specifically look at and promote inclusion of aged or older people in emergency management planning and response. So, but we don't include it directly. It's in there indirectly, and in a slightly more expanded version, it should be in there. Thanks.
Okay. Because of time, I suggest we have one last question. Okay. So the next question, let's see. Okay, it's from Vincent from National Tsinghua University, Hualien, Taiwan. So the question is the extent to which oil extraction affect the Earth's stability framework. Will we move to alien planet in the future?
Well, you may well laugh, Dr. Lee, but one of my nephews is actually working on travel to Mars. So.
Elon Musk. That's a question for Elon Musk, right?
Yeah, but look, I won't be moving there, I guess. So I'm hoping, the short answer is I'm hoping that we can put this off for a while yet. But yeah, is that so? Again, not a very satisfactory response to your question. I'd like to thank all the people who came along and who have posed questions, and apologies for the perhaps slightly inadequate responses.
No, that's all good. Okay, so let's let me just before we close the forum, let me thanks again for all the audience, for your enthusiastic participation. Maybe some of you still have questions for John. I recommend it. Either you can still leave your message on the YouTube chat box, and John will certainly will transmit this message to you. You want
sure.
to like.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Okay, and especially I will thank John. Thanks again to your really participation and really good preparation for today's forum. It was very excellent talk, and I learned a lot. Appreciate you take your time for all this talk, preparation of the lecture and Q&A, and I hope that everybody enjoyed this. I enjoyed it a lot. And,
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank John again, and for all of you, the ICOE Taipei certainly will go forward. Still, we plan maybe in the next few months still have another
good
master talk forum, and we also expect if the pandemic situation getting better, we could have another kind of activity, like training course or face-to-face workshop. And
we're all looking forward to that. We're all looking forward to it.
Yeah. Right. So I encourage you to follow up the news and information from ICOE, Taipei, and Academia Sinica. So I don't know, John, do you have a few words to say? Otherwise,
I just would like to thank everybody who's participated and come along and listened to the talk and asked the questions. And of course, I'd really like to again thank the ICOE for hosting this event. It's actually been good for me to have to rethink, go back through things and think about them. And also thanks for the difficult questions.
Okay, good. Well, good. Thank you, John. Thank you all of you, and special thanks for our really work very hard staff. Without you, this kind of online video conference cannot go so smoothly. All right, so that's time for say goodbye. Thank you very much. And goodbye.
Thanks, John. Very good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gordon. See you.
Gordon, thank you for joining us. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Thanks, Gordon. Sleep well.
That's where I'm going now.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Oh, Ella 在吗？